Today we're going to be talking about how to brew with the Hario V60, how to get the best results you can through a simple, repeatable technique that will give you a delicious cup of coffee. Now, I have designed this technique to work in a cafe as well as at home, to work whether you have a beautiful pouring kettle or whether you just have a regular kettle. It shouldn't matter. And even if you have your own preferred technique and way of brewing, I think there's going to be something in this video that you'll find useful to just elevate what you're doing a little bit more. So this video is focused just on the V60 for a couple of reasons. It's quite a different brewer to other brewers out there. It is a pure kind of cone shape, unlike say a flat-bottomed brewer or the Melita style brewers. And the brewer itself provides really no resistance whatsoever. Other brewers typically have three sort of small holes that will slow the water as it drains out of the cone. So the Hario has a large open area at the bottom of the cone, which means it provides no resistance. For those reasons, I wanted to make a video just focused on this because techniques that work here may not perfectly apply to the other brewers. So before we jump into the technique, I want to run through the list of kit that I would recommend you have on hand before you start brewing. And first and most obviously, you need a V60. I like the plastic ones. They're the cheapest, they're really hard to break, and they do a great job from a sort of heat retention perspective. Most of the time I actually use this, which is the Hario drip decanter, which is a nice glass body and a plastic insert. So it's all of the best bits. These are actually pretty cheap now, and I recommend them quite highly. When it comes to filter papers, and you're gonna need a digital scale. Now this thing is gonna make your life 100 times easier. It's gonna make your brews more repeatable. It's gonna take all the guesswork out of it. You want something accurate to 0.1 of a gram ideally. Some sort of spoon, teaspoon, soup spoon, dessert spoon, I don't really care, just some sort of spoon. And you're gonna need a kettle of some sort. Now my preference is that you pour the water into the V60 from the kettle that you boiled it in, which means something like this, which is an electric pouring kettle, is kind of the best possible outcome. This, a regular electric kettle, is absolutely fine. It's perfectly good. You can pour from this with no real issues. These things, just straight pouring kettles, they're okay if you're going to heat the water in it, but if you're decanting from a kettle into one of these, you're going to lose some temperature and that is going to affect your brew. And then you need coffee beans. Great technique is just going to give you transparency on your ingredients. The best technique in the world, beautifully executed but with low quality coffee, will just give you a perfectly terrible cup of coffee. Now the other ingredient is of course water, and it's a hugely important ingredient. It's going to make up 98% plus of your cup of coffee, and it's going to have a huge impact on the extraction itself. Now what you want basically is good tasting, relatively soft water. In some cases you can fix it with something like a Brita filter if your water's a little bit hard. In other cases it might be worth buying bottled water, as much as I dislike that idea. It is possible to make your own recipe water with the right combination of minerals in there. Now, while this will work with pre-ground coffee, I would absolutely recommend you buy a burr grinder. On the cheaper end, there are things like hand grinders if you're willing to do a little bit of work, but these days electric burr grinders are pretty approachably priced. They are a fantastic investment in how you start your day and will give you that extra layer of control to get the best out of the coffee that you buy. So let's get into the technique. Now here I'm going to recommend a ratio of 60 grams per liter or per kilo of water. That's kind of a point of preference. If you want to use 65, 70, or if you want to use 55, that's entirely up to you. It's not right or wrong. I just think it gives you a nice resulting strength in your cup of coffee. In the example today, I'm going to be brewing 30 grams to 500 grams, which is enough coffee for two people. I think it's a nice amount to share. Now, in terms of grind, I would recommend something that's on the slightly finer end of kind of medium. Now, it's really hard to communicate grind size in a video. I can show you some examples of the ideal grind size for a 30 to 500 ratio next to, say, some espresso grounds or next to something for scale. But we'll talk at the end about sort of tuning your grind to taste. So you want to weigh your beans right before you brew and grind them fresh, and at the same time you also want to rinse out your filter paper. That will help remove any potential papery tastes, and it will also preheat the brewer. If you have a plastic V60, then you can probably do that with really hot tap water, but if you have a glass or ceramic or even metal V60, I would recommend doing that with the hottest water possible. Add your grounds carefully to the center of the V60, and then once you've done that, create a little well in the middle of the grounds. This is going to be really helpful in the next phase, which is the bloom phase, to make sure that we're evenly saturating all of the grounds. You want to make sure you're using your water as hot as possible, certainly with lighter roasts. If you're using a pretty dark roasted coffee, it's okay to wait 15, 20, 25 seconds after the water is boiled before starting to pour. But if you're brewing something very light, the hotter the better. So make sure your scale is zeroed, start your timer, and immediately start to pour. And we're going to gently pour 2 grams of water per gram of coffee. So here, about 60 grams of water. And we want to make sure that we're trying to get all of the coffee wet in that initial phase. If you've got a large pocket of still dry coffee, you can use more water, but I really wouldn't use more than 3-to-1 in the bloom phase. As soon as you've added your water, put the kettle down and grab your brewer and begin to swirl in a circular motion. Now, what we're trying to do here is make sure that all of the water and coffee are nice and evenly mixed together. Some people like to do this with a spoon and to stir it together, but in testing, swirling tasted much better. And you're going to keep an eye on the sort of slurry as you swirl until you see it look nice and evenly mixed. If it looks lumpy, keep swirling. We're going to let it rest and bloom for up to 45 seconds. If you're in a cafe, you may only want to wait 30 as the returns do diminish a little bit beyond that, and I certainly wouldn't wait longer than 45 seconds. The theory is that we're allowing CO2 out of the grounds, making those grounds easier to extract in the remaining phase of our brew. And then we're gonna pour the rest of our water in kind of 2 phases, even though it's going to be one pretty continuous pour. Here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get 60% of our total liquid in the next 30 seconds. So we're going to aim to have 300 grams in total poured into the V60 by 1 minute and 15 seconds. This phase is actually really critical. Now, when you pour water into a V60, you disrupt that coffee bed, right? You churn it up a little bit. And it seems to me that in testing, there's a kind of ideal amount of churn. In situations where you don't disturb the bed at all, they produced very slow brews that didn't taste that good and would encourage you to grind coarser, which will mean you extract less. Pour too aggressively and you create channels and pockets through which water seems to run very quickly, essentially under-extracting the coffee and making it taste bad. Here, we do just a little bit of agitation, but not so much that we have an uneven extraction. Now, this means that with a smaller V60, if we're brewing just a 1 cup and say 15 to 250, you actually want a gentler pour because there's a smaller bed, which is why aiming for 60% gives you a kind of matching flow rate for the dose that you're using. So once you've hit 60% of your total brew weight, you'll see your cone is pretty full. And that's a good thing. We want the cone to be full for most of the brew to maintain that thermal mass. Keeping the temperature high is actually really, really important. What we're going to do now is pour a little slower and keep that cone topped up. We're going to aim to have 100% of our brew weight in the next 30 seconds. During this phase, we're going to pour gently, we're going to pour slowly. If you're pouring with a kettle without a pouring spout, it's okay to pulse a little bit. Just try not to pour too aggressively because you will disrupt the coffee bed unnecessarily at this point. Once you get to your total brew weight, pop the kettle down and grab a spoon and give the V60 a little stir in one direction and then a little stir in the other direction. What we're doing here is trying to knock off any ground stuck to the sidewalls of the paper and not create a sort of swirling motion that lasts, because that'll create a dome in our ground coffee, which we don't want. Allow the V60 to drain just a little bit more until it feels safe to do so, and give it one final swirl. And that's really going to help keep the bed flat at the bottom at the end of the brew and give you the most even possible extraction. But now we're into the drawdown. And the drawdown is a really interesting phase of this brew. Lots of different factors will affect your drawdown, and they're not always what you would think. One of the most surprising for me was temperature. In brewing identical brews side by side with 95 Celsius and 85 Celsius water, the drawdown in the cooler brew took 30 seconds more. Not only did this taste worse, it was a waste of time. So that's why I'm not a huge fan of taking water from a hot water source and putting it into a cold pouring kettle. I think often about cafes I see doing this. This is just a waste of the barista's time and the customer's time. If we brew hotter, we brew faster. As I mentioned before, the paper that you use will have an impact on your drawdown time. My preference is always for the faster papers. It doesn't have a massive impact on extraction if your paper slows your drawdown a little bit. Most of the brewing is done at this point already. It doesn't taste quite as good as a faster paper to me, but your results may vary. So one more quick thing. Most V60 videos will tell you not to pour directly onto the paper. You've always got to pour into the coffee or into that kind of slurry. They'll tell you this because they say that if you pour on the paper, the water goes through the paper, misses the coffee, and you dilute your coffee and it'll make it taste bad. This is not true. In my testing, I poured solely on the paper. I aimed to miss the coffee for the entire brew, and what happened is that the water just ran down the side of the paper, and in doing so, it didn't disturb the coffee bed at all. In fact, it resulted in the single longest drawdown of any brew that I had, and as a result, a slightly higher extraction than the other brews, but it tasted really bad. Now at the end, when the cone has fully drained out, what you want to see is a nice flat bed of coffee. There will always be some fine pieces of coffee stuck to the edges of the walls. They will not come off, but there should be no large pieces of coffee left. It should have all fallen into the middle. Throw that paper away, drink your coffee, and enjoy it. And I would recommend, for the most part, changing your extraction solely through changing your grind. If you find that coffee to be empty, hollow, a little acidic and unpleasant, go a little finer. In fact, most of the time, keep pushing finer until you hit this sudden wall of bitterness, harshness, and astringency. At that point, you've gone too far and you do want to come back a little bit coarser, but when you come back that little bit, you are kind of at the maximum extraction for your grinder, for your setup, for your coffee, and it should taste really, really great. This is my ultimate technique. This is what works the best for me. I really like the results from it. I'm not saying other people's techniques are wrong or that there's nothing to learn from them, but I think there's lots here that is hopefully useful to improve the coffee that you make every day. I'll say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.